Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in person at the Center for Latin American Arts and on Zoom on our webinar. My name is Dr. Catherine McCallan, and I'm the director of the Center for Latin American Arts. And I wanted to thank my incredible colleagues, Andres Amado, who is on our executive committee of the Center for Latin American Arts, and also our music faculty, Rebecca Coverly and David Sadlier, and the choir director, Matt Coffey, for hosting what was just an incredible masterclass and time to spend with Patricia. And right now she's going to be giving a lecture titled The Latin American Art Song, A Mirror of Identity. And we're excited that Patricia is here visiting us from Barcelona. She has been teaching recently and holding some scholarly positions as visiting artist and scholar at the University of California, Irvine, the University of California, Riverside, at the Center for Iberian and Latin American Music, more recently at TCU in Fort Worth. And Patricia is a soprano and musicologist whose scholarship and performances center around Latin American and Iberian art songs. She has released 11 albums and published numerous scholarly editions of scores and books, including the Latin American art song, Sounds of the Imagined Nations, which is the go-to history book on the subject. She's also an avid performer of these works, having performed around the world, in addition to founding and directing the Barcelona Festival of Song, where she is the director. And she also focuses on performances and study of Latin American and Iberian songs in Spanish, Catalan, and Portuguese. And she's recorded 11 CDs. And she's also the host of the podcast Latin American and Iberian Art Song, in which she interviews composers and leading experts around the world. And her numerous interdisciplinary projects integrate art, science, and technology. And an example of this is her latest new book, building on her knowledge as a physician as well, titled We Are What We Listen to, The Impact of Music on Individual and Social Health. So please join us in welcoming Dr. Patricia Caicedo.
Thank you very, very much for this invitation, for being here. I'm excited to be here and be with you yesterday and today, talking about what excites me more, that is Latin American and Iberian art song. So today, since I'm here with singers and musicians, I would like to explain a little bit of the context of creation of this genre that is so linked to our identity. But I would like to start with a question. So why do you think that the curricula of universities and conservatories of the world continue anchored in the Western European repertoire? What do you think this is happening? So to understand that, we have to go way back in history, perhaps before than I will mention. But during the 18th century, within the Enlightenment, the enlightened philosophers created what we call the science of man, and the humans at that time, the human sciences appropriated the model of physics to study their subjects from a pretended impartial point of view. So the Colombian philosopher Santiago Castro Gomez has called this pretension the hubris of the 0 point. And hubris was, in the Greek world, the biggest of sins, when men would like or pretended to be like God, observing everything from an impartial point of view, completely detached from the reality. So this is an attainable goal or aspiration. So that's why he said that this was, he called this the hubris of the 0 point, because the sciences in Santiago Castro Gomez idea, he said that the sciences of man built a discourse of the history of people, the history in which the people who were in Europe were in a place of a higher value, and they have their colonies, us and the rest of the world, in a lower place of value or appreciation. And this was necessary for their expansion, economical expansion, and for develop a model of the world that installed what we call the market economy or the capitalism. And so the enlightened philosophers established a dialectic between what we call centers at the time. They called the center were them, the Central Europe, and they represented modernity, and the American, Asian, and African peoples who represented tradition and were the ones aspirating to be like the ones in the centers. So from that time on, there was established a dialectic between what we call the center and the peripheries, assigning to those peripheries the ones who were in the pre-modern times, according to this paradigm. They were associated with the exotic, with the mysterious, the magical, the sensual, the corporeal, and the center appropriated of reason, the rational sphere, the written word. So in doing so, in creating this dialectic, this differentiation, they delegitimize the cultural productions of the peripheries, meaning the colonies, meaning us, meaning everywhere outside of the Central European axis. So at this moment, we witness the suppression of the historical multivocality of humanity. So all the knowledge produced in the peripheries was condemned to be the past of modern science. But you must be wondering, why am I talking about that? She should be talking about Latin American art song. What does this discussion has to do with music, or with the music we learn, we teach, we perform? So it has everything to do with the music we learn, we teach, and we perform, because at universities and musical institutions that train musicians of the world, in the curriculum is embodying or representing all those values that we just saw from the 18th and 19th century. The curriculum is perpetuating that by perpetuating mainly the music of the centers of power, the Central Europe. That's why we learn French, Italian, and German music mainly, even today in the 21st century, because we are perpetuating those values coming from that time that I mentioned. So this situation that I just explained in the singing world is seen as that we singers, we learn mainly German lied, Italian opera, aria antica italiana, French repertoire, and center around oratorio, opera, and lied, coming from that Western, what we call the canon. But to talk a little bit about myself, my experience, because I came to understand that because I experienced something when I was born in Colombia, and there I started singing when I was very 12 years old. I started singing. I studied music at 5 at the conservatory, but singing at 12. And when I started singing folk music. Actually, the first music I started singing were rancheras, because my grandmother loved rancheras. Why? Because in Colombia we have adopted rancheras since so many years ago, so to such a point that this is part of our own tradition. Nowadays, people give serenades with rancheras before getting married, or when the quinceañeras, or this is part of our culture, and there is a plaza with mariachis there when you go and hire them. So this happens in Colombia. So first music I started singing with my guitar teacher at home with my abuelita were rancheras. So Jose Alfredo Jimenez, all that music. And from that moment on, I started singing all different folk music traditions of Latin America. Argentinian music, Cuban music, Colombian music, boleros, or trova cubana. So all my teenagerhood, my years in the university, I was singing that. But when I went back to the conservatory at 23 years old to study voice, so immediately that music disappeared. So I was thinking, but what happened is that music doesn't exist in the curriculum. Perhaps it's not good music, it's not good enough. So it was thanks to a teacher, one of my first voice teacher at the conservatory. She went out of the curriculum and she assigned me a song by an Argentinian composer called Alberto Ginastera. So was this song. We don't have the sound connected, but the amplification. Hay un árbol que del olvido se llama, al que van a destinarse fidelidad, los moribundos del alma. We need the connect here.
Hay que sacar el audio para que se vea.
So let's see, we do something here. Is the film, is este? Probably is this one. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
Let's try. Okay, this is just a technical thing that we are used to technical. Oh, now! Because we will have many musical examples. So this is a song by Alberto Ginastera, an Argentinian composer who was writing during the nationalistic period. And I felt immediately identified and I wanted to sing more of that music because I grew up in a home where my dad was hearing day and night the Western classical music, Chopin, Beethoven, and symphonies. That was home. And outside I was singing the folk music. So when I found this song, it seems like these two worlds finally encounter. So I felt that music, I identified with that music. On top of it, it was in my own language. So I could connect with the emotions very directly. So I said, let's go to look for more of those songs. I want to buy more sheet music. So I went to the music store, in Colombia, trying to find that music. And they said, no, we don't have that. Or they had a few scores of Argentinian music published by Ricordia Americana in Argentina, but no more than that. Or perhaps some Spanish art song from Spain, Falla, Granados, Rodrigo, the ones that are published, but no more Latin American art song. They even imply that I should, why are you singing that music? Why don't you sing Schubert? Implying that music was of a better quality. So I start like kind of obsessed looking for sheet music, the art songs, Latin American art songs, finding many obstacles, and I had to find those songs in private archives or photocopies of copies of somebody. And in a short time, my collection grew so much that I had, in a few years, almost 2,500 Latin American art songs from 18 countries. So I said, wow, the genre exists and is huge and is of a very good quality. Why is hidden? So why nobody appreciated, nobody sing that? So I identify a vicious circle that starts with the lack of appreciation in their own countries, that we know now that the lack of appreciation is not because they are in the country they are bad people. It's because we are functioning under those paradigms of thought coming from the colonial times, in which we believe that the only valid and legitimate and good artistic productions come from Europe, and ours are not equally good. We now believe it. Our minds are colonized. So since our minds are colonized, we are even unconsciously neglecting our own music. We don't appreciate it. We don't don't publish it, we don't perform it, nobody record that, nobody knows about that, and the music falls into oblivion. So I identified this vicious circle, and I decided, let's go to look for this in Latin America, look for this music, and let's try to understand. And this is the journey we are starting now. So when we are talking about Latin American art song, we are talking about the art songs from the Rio Grande that is here down. So, which means there are songs that are in many different languages, and also when the Spanish art song, I mean our previous colonizers are Portugal and Spain, and in that's what we call the Iberian Peninsula. It's a region extremely diverse with many languages, actually hundreds of languages if we consider the indigenous languages, but mainly are the Spanish, Portuguese, Spanish that is spoken nowadays for almost 600 million people, Portuguese, Catalan, and indigenous languages, and other languages like Basque, Galician, and indigenous languages, but I will focus on these ones. And you perhaps know that that part of the world was conquered by Spain and Portugal mainly. And there are many languages also including in some of the Caribbean islands, French, English, and the indigenous languages that I just mentioned. So the concepts I would like you to have before starting to enter into that is two concepts that I'm sure you already know. That is the concept of art song, so what are we referring, and what is nationalism. So art song is, when I'm saying art song, I'm referring to these compositions mainly for voice and piano, but they could be also for voice and guitar. At the beginning of the 18th, 19th century, composers, mainly in the German-speaking countries, where they were looking for what they made them unique, what defined them. So what they found that defined them was their language. So they looked for their greatest poets, Goethe, Schilling, and all those greatest revered poets, and composers of academic training like Schubert, Schumann, Wolf. They start setting to music those poems in short compositions for voice and piano, in which the piano was not just a mere accompaniment, just sounding there, no, was equally important than the voice, and both voice and piano were weaving a net to enhance the meaning of the poem. So we are all, the composer and the performers, are at the service of the poem, of the word. That's the art song. That became a genre, an aesthetic model that, of course, since it was going out from that center of power that was where the German-speaking countries of the time, they went to other countries and were adopted, and our composers in the colonies tried to follow that model, and they started to compose in using that aesthetic model of art song. And also the other concept is nationalism, musical nationalism. So for most of you, the first thought when you say musical nationalism will be the inclusion of folk elements or folk motifs in musical compositions. But this was true at the beginning of at that first moment of nationalism, but little by little through time, and it was becoming more subjective, if we could say it. And nowadays, nationalistic music could be any music that a composer wrote with the intention of being national, even if the music doesn't have any folk motive, or if the audience received that music as and identify themselves as with that music as something national. That's also nationalistic music, even if it's in serialistic or dodecaphonic or whatever, without any trace of folk music. So this is very abstract now. But at that moment, in the in the beginning, in the period we are talking, it was closely related to the folk motif. And it was also for what was the reason of writing this nationalistic music. All these efforts to create those emblems and symbols have as a goal to build and construct a narrative around something called the nation state. So this is what we will talk now. So one of the first songs, but before that I have to tell you that to situate you in the time frame we were colonies, but between 1810 and 1830 most of our countries achieved independence. We fought wars of independence, we won, we are independent. And Brazil, they didn't have to fight independent wars, they were given the independence by Dom Pedro, and so they were suddenly independent. And now what? Now we have to start to look for who we are, how we define ourselves, and how through symbols like music we express who we are. And one of the first symbols was the national anthem. Imagine, in the 19th century they were writing national anthems, but who were the ones who were in charge of the new nations? If you have in mind, we were made of the indigenous who were or the original peoples of the land that were almost erased or they disappear almost, and the Europeans who arrived and the Africans. So we were a tricultural group, but the ones who got in charge of the new nations were the sons and daughters of the Spaniards or the Europeans, the Creoles. So they had as their model of the beautiful, they would like to sound and be like Europe. So they start constructing that new nation around those values to be like Europe, to sound like Europe. And the best expression of that, example of that, is to listen to the national anthems. So let's listen to the national anthem of Mexico. So, like what? Do you it's familiar or it sounds like what? Like, let's listen to another thing to see if you can tell me to what it sounds like. Yes! Like an overture, an opera overture. So yes, that sounds like, and if you look at the names, in fact, he was Jaume Nuno, was the name of the composer of the Mexican anthem. He was from Catalonia, and Josep de Valli was an Hungarian composer, and most of the Latin American national anthems were written by Europeans, and they were in the style of opera. Opera was taken by storm the whole world. That was the music in fashion at the time, but not in fashion of everybody. Was the fashion of everybody was the fashion of the elites, the people who have the money. So we want to, and the power. So we want to sound like them, the ones in charge in Europe. We want to sound like Europeans. So we start building that identity around those values. And also parlor music, or music that is made at homes, with piano in urban spaces. This music was also confined to the elites, people who held the power, was very popular. There were many pianos in Latin America, thousands of pianos. There are some writings that say that in Havana or in Bogota, 19th century, there were thousands of pianos, and people were singing at their homes piano reductions of opera arias of these opera companies who arrived from Italy, or zarzuela companies who arrived from Spain. So that was very popular among the elites, and women were a very important agent in keeping and promoting this kind of vocal music, because they were the ones who sung at the soirees at home. And they were also very important in the transmission of music, because they were teachers. So although there were not many music women composers at the time, they were instrumental in preserving and promoting and teaching music in society. And very early on, even in 1701, there were examples of operas in Mexico, La Púrpura de la Rosa by Manuel Torrejón y Velasco, or Parténope by Manuel de Sumaya, who was a super prolific Mexican composer, but one of the most important composers of opera of the time, who was debuting his operas in La Scala de Milan, was Carlos Gomez. And Carlos Gomez, who was a mulatto guy, he was debuting all his operas in Italy. And let's listen to the Obertura of Il Guarani, an opera that is important also because the subject was talking about an indigenous tale. Oh, let's see if we can hear the Guarani. So the composers, Latin American composers, were acquiring their tools and being trained in Europe, most of them belonging to the elites also. They could travel, afford going there to study. And it's the same fashion that was happening in the United States. I mean, the whole continent, the composers were there to Europe to be trained. And most at that time, at the beginning of the 18th century, soon after the 19th century, soon after the national independences, most of our composers were writing art songs in German, in Italian, and in French, because those were the languages that deserved to be set to music, like the languages of Europe. But there were a few exceptions, like the collection called the Moginhas Imperiais, compiled by Mario Giandrade. So let's listen to one of these songs that is important because it's already in Brazilian Portuguese. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Okay. Paciencia. Also sounds like an aria. Younger. So you see, it sounds like an Italian aria, but it's already in Portuguese. It's a huge step because it's using one of our languages. And let's see, we're advancing in time. I'm jumping huge jumps. So if we go 100 years after the national independences, let's say between 1910 and 1930, we start seeing what we call creolism, that is the tendency to mix rhythms of European origin and reinterpret these rhythms in here, and also using other instruments, and like including the rhythms that we have that are from what we call folk music, that mainly were done with guitar. That was an instrument of easy transport, and that was not the instrument of the elites, that was the piano, but in the rural areas the guitar was the instrument. And so many of the rhythms associated with the guitar were mixed and reinterpreted by composers, and at that moment rhythms that now we identify as national rhythms of Colombia, Mexico, and all the countries were appear at this time. And at that time, and also why it's happening that, because in Europe, composers like Dvorak, Bartók, Grieg, all those guys start in Spain, Pedrell, they start creating music, art music, or music, orchestral music, or music for piano, etc., using these folk elements, as we mentioned, the nationalistic period. So what they do, in creating this music, was sometimes like stylizing the folk music and transporting the songs to higher key, to adapt it to the techniques of the singers, the classically trained singers, and adapting that for the piano, adapting the sound of the guitar to the piano. And so they were doing that in Europe. So composers, Latin American composers, who were used to follow their example of Europe, because that was the model, they went to sound like, be like. So they start doing the same, going out of this salon, the cities, and looking for the rural musics and motifs. So let's listen to that. So we see in that song many interesting things. The subject is talking about an indigenous instrument. It's a part of a collection called Canciones Incaicas, referring to the Incas, the indigenous peoples that inhabit Peru and part of Latin America. So it's kind of an idealization of the contribution of the indigenous. So composers start looking at that and putting those elements as symbols, also using the pentatonic scale that was associated, or the way of imagining how music, indigenous music, could be. So composers start imagining and creating this indigenous sound, and also creating song collections, song cycles, like, for example, Manuel de Falla did. Manuel de Falla, who was Spaniard, was one of their composers, admired composers. He wrote the 7 canciones populares españolas. So when de Falla writes the 7 canciones populares españolas, he does it in Paris. He was studying in Paris. Paris at that moment was the Mecca, the cultural Mecca. So now we don't want to look or sound like Spain. Now we want to look and sound like Paris. That France is where the center of the culture, and all composers go to study there. And even Manuel de Falla, so he writes these 7 popular Spanish songs using 7 different rhythms, dance rhythms of regions of Spain. And Latin American composers, who always also had as a point of reference Spain, start following that. And Alberto Williams writes the 5 canciones populares argentinas. He writes also later on Ginastera, and there are many song collections, like the 7 canciones venezolanas by Juan Bautista Plaza, and collections and collections and collections of similar song cycles in the same vein as the song cycle of Falla. But there was a guy who we already listened to a song in the master class, Coração Triste. They were sung in Portuguese. Alberto Nepomuceno was a Brazilian composer. He was studying in Germany, he studied also in Italy, and being there, he fell in love with a woman, a pianist, who was from Norway. And then when he went to ask for the hand of this woman, he went to Norway, and she used to be a student of Greek. So they went to visit Greek, and Nepomuceno listened to some of Greek's art songs in Norwegian. At the time, Nepomuceno was writing art songs in German, and he was Brazilian. So he said, oh my goodness, I could write, if this guy is writing in Norwegian, that 4 cats speak Norwegian, and it's not German, Italian, and French. So I could write also in Portuguese. So he started a crusade, and he said, não te pátria o povo que não canta na sua própria língua, saying that the country that does not sing in his own language has no homeland. And he started a crusade, and when he went back as a director of the National Conservatory in Rio de Janeiro, he started with this crusade, finding a lot of opposition. But he started setting to music the poems of the Brazilian poets. So you already know that song. So what I just mentioned is that we mentioned in the class, and I will never stop insisting that the most important of the art song is the poem, the word. So at that moment, the composers start to be kind of tuned with their own poets, meaning that they felt that the same problems, they were feeling the same problems, tuned with the same concerns that they were experiencing in their own countries. So they start setting to music their own poets. And it could be a long list, their own poets in Peru, in Puerto Rico, in Mexico, etc., etc. Until we arrive to this moment that I call creative storm, that is 100 years after the independence, in which the 100 years we have been trying to build our nation, ruled, controlled by the elites, the European descendant elites, that were neglecting the contribution of the African descendants and the indigenous. But they feel that for economical expansion, they need to include them. So the first thing that they include are their emblems, their symbols, music. So it is a mechanism of abstract inclusion, meaning we include their emblems, their symbols, but they are in the concrete, they continue to be excluded, as happens in many parts of Latin America even today. But this expressed itself in different parts of the country in different ways. So in Argentina, there was a movement or a group of composers who created the Movimiento Renovación. And they were also inspired by the figure of the gaucho. The gaucho was this guy who embodied the values of the being close to the earth, hard-working, honest guy, who was faithful to his roots. So he represented some values that they wanted to highlight to their music and artistic productions. So let's listen to this. And in this song, you will listen very, very evidently how the guitar is present there, even is not there. So you see the guitar, you feel it. So it's a song that was adapted or to the piano, but it comes from the guitar. Angelita.
Es el cura notorio en la casa del
Angelita toma mate.
alegra la alegría y destiñe la pena, el mate amargo.
So you see, mate de gaucho drinks mate. So all those emblems were highlighted to become part of the nationalness of what constructs what makes the nation and the identity, the national identity. So there were many, many Argentinian composers in different periods. I just mentioning here a few of them that were important writing art songs. I cannot stop in all of them, but then you can read one of my books and see them. And there were also many women. So among the composers, like Lia Cimaglia, like Montserrat Capmany, and others. Irma Urtiaga, that I also have published her collection of all her art songs for voice and piano. So it's important. And you can listen to, it's a shame that I don't have internet here, because I could show you here. If you go, let's I try to look. If you look for my name here, no, I don't have internet. But let's see if I have my phone somewhere here and I can connect to my phone. Not. Oh, my phone. I think Catherine has my phone. Yes. So I will lend internet, because why? Why I'm doing, gracias Carlos, I'm doing this because tick 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 tick. Okay, because I have created many playlists. Let's see if now we can work with this. Yes, so now let's see what is happening there, but it's not showing Patricia. Let's see. I invite the viewers of this class. You can see, oh yes, artist. All. So you will see the artist, but you also will see the user. So the user Patricia, if you follow her, she has created probably hundreds of curated playlists that are pedagogical tools for you or for the singers to learn about, listen to Argentinian art song, Argentinian folk rhythms, Brazilian art song, Catalan art song, Colombian art song, Chilean, Cuba. So you have all that, all those resources, you have them there. And also art songs by women composers, etc. So for you to, when you go home, you can do your research and listen to more music. And what was happening in Peru was, at that same period, there was the indigenous nationalism. So they, at this moment, 100 years after, they started to highlight the indigenous contribution to their identity. So there was a composer called Teodoro Valcárcel, who was very important because was one of the first ones, or perhaps the first one, who created an entire song cycle called 31 Cantos del Alma Vernácula, 31 songs in indigenous languages, in Quechua and Aymara. That was a landmark, something super important. So let's listen to that. those songs are very important because they are in indigenous languages, and they were published in 1929, and so that's a stepping stone in the history of Latin American art song. So there were many other Peruvian composers that would be a source of another lecture. In Brazil, what was happening there is that they achieved independence in 1922. They were given the independence, as I mentioned before, by Don Pedro in February 1922. And 100 years after, in February 1922, they celebrated the A Semana de Arte Moderna, the Week of Modern Art. And they were led by an amazing man who was Mario Giandracci. He was a poet, a writer, a composer, a thinker, a Renaissance man, a mulatto man, also descendant of Africans, who led this Semana de Arte Moderna and put together concerts, exhibitions, bringing the young Heitor Villalobos, Anita Malfatti, the painter, and many other artists that were very important. And he said, we have to gather together during this week to think what it means to be a Brazilian. How is that the Brazilian song should sound? How is that the language, the Brazilian Portuguese, should be used when we sing? What is what identity in language when we sing? A few years after, he created the first congress in which all people from all over the country, a huge country, it's almost half of continent, Brazil, they gather to think, to create for the first time norms for Brazilian Portuguese when it's sung. Imagine, as early in 1925 or 26 or 29, I don't remember exactly, but in the 20s, after the Semana de Arte Moderna. So for him, song was the ideal medium to express the national identity, and he influenced many composers like Camargo Guarnieri, like Villalobos, like many others who were trying to look for this national sound in song. So there were, Villalobos we all know, but there were many other composers, and there are literally thousands of good quality composers in Brazil, art song composers. I collaborate with a research group at the Universidade de Minas Gerais, where we have access to a collection of more than 3,000 Brazilian art songs of amazing quality, all of them, that were compiled by an aficionado of art song who died. So now we are trying to catalogate and organize and do things with that music, but it's amazing manuscripts. So Brazilian music has influences, also African influences, indigenous, rural and folk influences, but the main types of songs in Brazilian art song are the Mojinha and the Lundu. And the Mojinha is a romantic song coming from the European lyrical song, sentimental song. And let's listen to one of the first Mojinhas written by one composer who early in the 18th century was considered the best composer of the Americas, of the continent. He wrote he was the chapel master of the court of the King João in Brazil. I don't know if you know, but when Napoleon was arriving to Portugal, invading all countries, the King João took all his court in some ships and traveled to their colonies to Brazil, and was living in Brazil, the only king, European king, who lived in their colonies in the Americas was the King João. So he brought all the court with all what it means to bring all the culture, poets, musicians, etc. But he appointed Jose Mauricio Nunes Garcia as the chapel master of the court in Rio de Janeiro. He was probably the best composer of the time in the continent, in America, right, and who composed oratorios, masses, leads, all kind of music. And this is one of his modinhas in Portuguese. And the lundu is the other type of song that comes directly from Africa, and that it comes from a dance called the umbigada. Umbigo is navel, so it was a dance in which the two navels touch. So it was considered obscene for some time, but then it was becoming more sophisticated and stylized, and became one of the most important genres in song. So let's listen to one very early lundu. That sounds like a samba. So it's the predecessor of samba. So there were also women composers. How are we doing with time? So I need to know. How many minutes do I have?
Like maybe 10, 15?
10? Ah!
We started a little late though, so we can go a little late.
Until when can we go? So tell me,
We started at 5:40, so like 4:40, so maybe 10, 15 minutes.
15 minutes. Oh, okay. So there were also women composers. I always trying to include the women composers, and one of the most important composers of the time was Chiquinha Gonzaga in Brazil. And I also have published some of her songs. I have 2 anthologies of Latin American and Iberian art songs by women composers in 2 volumes. And some of her music is there. She was a pioneer in many areas. She was fighting for the rights of the copyright, for women rights also. She divorced in that time that was not something that women could not do. She was rejected by her family and society, but she continued being a musician. And the best of all, when she was like late in her life, she married a guy who was like 20 years younger, and they lived together until she died. So she defied all the norms of the society of her time. So she was a pioneer. And so this song is by Chiquinha Gonzaga, and she's my student, Katie McCall. So beautiful. So I'm sorry that I have to cut, but there are other women composers like Babi Oliveira, like Elsa Cameo. All those songs, I have recorded many of those songs. You can find if you follow now, not the user but the artist. I have 2 CDs of art songs by Latin American and Catalan women composers, and all that music is recorded on Spotify. So in Colombia also there were many composers of the different periods. The one that I would like to highlight is Jaime León, who was born in 1921 and died in 2015. So Jaime León, I also would like to highlight him because he was Colombian, he was born in Colombia, but he spent long time in the United States, so he had both nationalities, and his music has the elements of the European music, some elements of the Colombian folk rhythms, but a lot of influence of the musical theater and the harmonies of the American songbook music, because he was the conductor of the American Ballet Theater Orchestra at the same time that Bernstein was the conductor of the New York Philharmonic, and Gershwin and all these guys were doing the amazing musicals, and the American songbook was in their prime in the moment. So he loved that music, and all those harmonies are there, here and there, and that music. And he was an amazing pianist. So the songs are great for the singers because he knew very well the vocal instrument, but also for the pianist. So that's very high quality art song. I published 2 books with all his songs, art songs, with IPA, with translations of the poetry, with everything. So it's super easy for you to perform. And I also recorded a CD with all his songs. I'm also a composer sometimes. and I have some of my songs also that have been published and sung. So this is a song that today there was a girl who would sing it, but she couldn't come. So I will let you listen to a little bit of this song. It's in rhythm of pasillo. Pasillo is a rhythm that we share between Colombia and Ecuador. Listen, let's see the pasillo come. Mystery. The mysterious song. A ver qué pasó. Ha! No está. You will have to ignore that. Let's see if we can find it somewhere over the rainbow. No. Someday. So because we have a lot to cover, especially we cannot ignore what was happening in Cuba. Because in Cuba there was another phenomenon, that was the Afro-Cubanism, trying to acknowledge the contribution of the Africans to the conformation of our identity, the Cuban identity. So led by the poet Nicolas Guillen, many composers start composing songs because Nicolas Guillen published a few poems in which he imitated the way that the blacks speak. That was considered wrong. But he wrote these poems, published them in the newspaper on different Sundays, and some composers said, "Oh, let's get set this to music," and they started this slogan, like their crusade was "Abajo el lirismo, arriba el bongo." El bongo is this instrument that is used in the son music. This is the son. So this is that was the rhythm, and this is one of the poems, Ayer me dijeron negro, set to music by Amadeo Roldán. And there is another song also by this same collection of poems, set to music by Amadeo Roldán. 1, 2, 3. So you hear how I always, when I listen to that, I say, what are we doing still singing only Schubert? I mean, yes, I love Schubert. I don't want to say that I don't. but I mean, there is so much interesting, beautiful, good quality music coming from our continent, so much American music that we can sing, that I mean, it's a sin not to do it. It's a sin not only for us, but for our audiences. Imagine how they will enjoy getting to know this music that is connected to what they are. So there were many composers in Cuba, many composers also are now bridging with the bolero and the musical traditions. Great bolero singers that we could be listening here, but this, for next time you will invite me, I will continue with that. And an amazing composer called Gisela Hernandez, who wrote a lot of art songs, good quality art songs. I published a few of them in the second volume of the anthology by women composers, and she's one of the students of the festival who sings one of her songs. I'm so sorry. I see we are about to end. I'm sorry. So the only thing I would like, I will still have Mexico, Puerto Rico, Venezuela, etc., etc. But as I mentioned at the beginning, I discovered this vicious circle. You remember, not appreciating. So the challenge that I invite you to join me in this challenge, to contribute to decolonizing the minds of classical singers and voice teachers. And you are the ones who will do this. We have to be together to this challenge. And for me to break this vicious circle, I created a virtual circle, or I'm trying to doing research, performing, publishing, recording, teaching, selling the music through an online store, having a summer program to train singers, también singers, musicologists, and pianists, and guitarists. And I have created this collection of books that is called the Latin American and Iberian Vocal Music Collection that has, I have mentioned many of those within this talk. So there are Brazilian art songs by women composers, the two books by Jaime León, also a book of Spanish diction for singers, etc., etc. And these are the women composers. You find that at mundoarts.com. And the Barcelona Festival of Song, that is a summer program in which singers can go there to be 10 days working day and night, learning art songs in Catalan, in Spanish, and in Brazilian Portuguese, learning the diction, the history, the composers, the performance practice, and singing in 2 concerts in Barcelona every summer. So the registration is open now to participate in the summer 23. And the CDs are all in Spotify. You can follow me, it's for free. And also I have a podcast in which I interview people from composers, poets, performers, and people who belong to this world of Latin American music and Iberian music. So this is also available, and this is my web. You can also go there and follow me on Instagram. So we are connected through the digital networks, and we continue the conversation. And if you ever need repertoire or ideas or something, so you send me a message. And that's it. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Gracias, 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 gracias.